I'm going to make this a video. I don't really know how well it's going to do, but I'm going to make this a video. So I'm going to give some context for why we're making the video. Please ignore the no glasses and please ignore the tank top. It is very hot and humid where I am right now. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make a Shadow Blight build that is also using Bloodless Scream. The reason why we care about Bloodless Scream is because they added in this lucky hit chance to be able to deal shadow damage. And because of some kind of weird bug, increasing your attack speed directly modifies the damage of this effect. So if you have 100% attack speed in Cap 1, this effect does double damage. What we're trying to accomplish is scale this damage as hard as we can. So we would like to get up to 200% total attack speed, 100 in Cap 1 and 100 in Cap 2. The only real way to be able to accomplish that would be with a blood skill like Blood Lance, along with Rathmas to be able to gain 55% increased attack speed from overpowering, and the addition of accelerating aspect. But utilizing those kind of ignores a couple different things about the build. So Bloodless Scream's big damage multipliers are for darkness skills, and they grant ranks to darkness skills. The thing that says it applies fear literally doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with the build at all. But the proc damage is shadow damage. It's not a darkness skill. So this damage right here, the bonus here, will not work for that proc. It would increase darkness skill damage, but it won't increase the proc. When you're thinking about a build like this, when you're dealing with lucky hit chance is a very finicky thing. So lucky hit chance 40% here gets multiplied by the coefficient of your skill. So if we look at a couple different options here, Sever with my amount of bonus lucky hit chance, which I have, I have 75% bonus lucky hit chance. So I'm multiplying the base by 1.757. Has a tooltip lucky hit chance of 70%. The tooltip is not always accurate because things like channeled skills or damage over time is actually expected proc rate over a set duration. So for instanced damage, lucky hit chance is near accurate or often very accurate. But for things like Blight, nowhere near accurate, or things like Corpse Explosion, nowhere near accurate. That's why if you ever try to proc lucky hit chance via Soul Rift, you'll notice that you basically never do it. So we have a 40% chance from here, and we have a 70% chance here on Sever. Now, Sever does have a 70% chance to be able to trigger this on each damage instance that it would apply. So if I were to attack with the Reaping Lotus aspect on, this will add on 3 additional specters at the end of the travel that will then shoot out. So this is doing basically 4 Severs worth of damage, plus you get the travel damage as well. When it travels, it does damage over the area that it travels. So technically speaking, on a single target, you could hit them with 8 damage instances, each one of which would have a 70% chance of triggering the 40% chance. So 40% chance multiplied by 70% chance is a 28% chance on average to be able to trigger this per damage instance. And then you have 8 instances over which you would have a chance to trigger it. So on a single cast, you would expect to trigger this at least one time a lot of the time. And the damage number coming out the side there, the 1,043,000, or the half of that, the 598,000, is an instance of this. So every cast, I'm triggering it anywhere between like 1 to 4 times. And if you were to play out the math and look at like a binomial distribution, that would probably play out to be what your expect was. So that's the context. That's the build that we're trying to build into. And those are the types of mechanics that we're trying to keep in mind here. So since we don't want to lose out on the darkness skill damage in its entirety, what is a good skill that also does shadow crit damage? Well, that's why we're using Sever as our example. And the cool part about Sever is that Sever's unique boots, Greaves of the Empty Tomb, allow you to get up to chance for Sever to deal double damage. So on paper, since the darkness skill damage multiplier will work on Bloodless Scream, and our boots can get us up to deal double damage of 100%, not only that, the Sever size is also kind of good because the Sever size will make sure that each individual Sever will hit as many targets as possible. That means that we can actually have a fairly cohesive build where our proc ability for the damage instance from Bloodless Scream will synergize with the actual damage of a core skill. So then we have to ask some questions of what kind of multipliers can we put onto the build so that it will increase both damage sources. Luckily, things like Sacrificial Aspect, which will increase our shadow damage here, our vulnerable damage, and our crit damage, will work for both of them. So that's typically a very easy include. Putting it onto the amulet is a very large damage multiplier. Then obviously we need to fit on Reaping Lotus, because Reaping Lotus is the thing that effectively doubles our chance of proccing this. So an aspect which doubles the rate at which you proc it can roughly be calculated as a 100% damage increase. Not only that, it is a thing that makes Sever a viable skill for damage scaling. So that's a really easy inclusion there. And then we have to start thinking about different aspects. Now, remember, getting up to cap 2 of 100% increased attack speed would further multiply our damage. So we start running into some issues. And if I were to move myself, what you're looking at is a completely built out character with all of their masterworking on, a complete skill tree, and a complete paragon tree. I'm in Torment 4. So the first big thing that becomes an issue of actually making this build viable is I can't cap my armor. Now, if I were to consume the armor incense, and then the resistance that also grants you armor incense, I would reach my cap. So as long as I'm willing to always consume those two things, we've hit cap, we can generally accept that and move on. We'll also be able to hit our resistances cap because the incense that grants us the additional armor also grants us maximum all res. So that one's kind of okay. We come down here, we're going to be crit capped. That's if the build has the appropriate masterworks that I need for it to have and the greater affixes that I need it to have. Now, that being said, we have a little bit of wiggle room here too. So luckily, I think this is going to be pretty easy to manage, but we have to start talking about attack speed. So at this point, everything that I said, hopefully, is fairly logical. You're able to follow it, and you can think about them as numbers. But I was sitting here on stream, and I realized I hadn't really said anything for about 10 minutes. And it's because while I can articulate all these things and we can think about them just as the raw numbers and the ways of solving them, I don't necessarily see this build like it is on the piece of paper in front of you. And this is where we finally get back into people ask me all the time, how do you theorycraft? And like, what do you do to even imagine these things? So I'm kind of imagining like an old school, either, you know what it is? Do you all know, what is it called? House of the Dead? Is that what it is? House of the Dead arcade. Yeah, House of the Dead. House of the Dead arcade, and then boss weak spot. Okay. So this is kind of what I see in my head when I'm thinking about this build, where there are the constituent parts of the build. The build is kind of, I'm looking at a Necromancer in my head. And then you have these weak points. These weak points are caps that I need to hit or things to consider. And they kind of exist as blocks in a little picture in front of me. Right now, in these blocks in front of me, armor is red. Armor is red, armor needs to be solved. There are a couple different things beneath armor, almost in like a drop-down folder, that would allow me to solve it, which include elixirs, which include changing a piece of gear and adding on an armor affix to them. But that's like over here. Luckily, I think I have armor mostly solved. So I'm basically going to like, you know how you hit the drop down and then you minimize it and it rolls back up into a folder? Armor is going to go back up into the folder. Crit chances in the green, that goes back up into the folder. Resistances are kind of orange, but again, that we already have a solve for that, so that's going to go back up into the folder. And then we start talking about attack speed. Attack speed is red because we are far off from having 200% increased attack speed. Cap 1 attack speed is attack speed in your gear, so attack speed on your rings, etc. This would require me to have GA double masterwork crit attack speed on multiple rings, also to have attack speed on my amulet, which means that I'm losing out on some damage. So down here, there's a list of things that scale damage, and one of them is a passive on your amulet. But if I have to swap that over to attack speed, obviously that's going to reduce damage here. Luckily, attack speed is double dipping on the build. Attack speed will increase the rate at which we attack, which means increase the opportunities to proc this effect per second, as well as adding a multiplier to the base damage. So when we're considering the loss here and the gain here is significantly higher. So this is like one tier up in my understanding of the value of this stat on this piece of gear. So we're going to gray out damage loss down here, and we're going to bold or check mark damage gain over here. You'll see that I'm at 88.5% increased attack speed. Now, luckily, we'll be able to hit a cap of 100% attack speed, because the best elixir that we would use on this build would be the plus 15 attack speed as well as lucky hit chance, because lucky hit chance is a direct multiplier of our chance to be able to successfully trigger the effect. So that has a value. And because this elixir does both of them, I regain a little bit of wiggle room here, because attack speed, it currently being at 88.2 based off of what my Paragon looks like and my gear, means that I could remove either some points from Paragon, which would allow me to regain damage down here and overall scalability, or you have the overall constraint on the build, which is gear requirements. This kind of like looms over the character behind it, which says, is it reasonable for me to assume that I'll even have this gear? Because if we go back into the game, and I look at my gear, this is a good ring for this build. Really high intelligence, GA on lucky hit chance, which again, further increases our chance of triggering a thing. And it has a decent roll of attack speed. It's not GA and it's not double masterworked. So I'd have to re-roll this ring multiple times, as opposed to some alternatives here. Like, this is a good ring, but again, it doesn't have the GA on attack speed. These kind of concepts are in there. There's looming behind there. But technically speaking, I've regained a little bit of that wiggle room. So we're going to take attack speed, and we are generally going to close cap 1. So if it's a folder, I'm going to close cap 1. I don't have to think about this anymore. But cap 2 is deep in the red, because I don't really have a way of adding cap 2 attack speed to my build. If we go look at the things that increase our cap 2 attack speed for the Necromancer, we have accelerating aspect, something I can't really fit onto the build. You might say, well, why not? Well, if we go look at the build, I actually have an additional aspect slot that I haven't currently slotted in. I would want it to probably be Damned, because Damned is a 55% damage multiplier for shadow damage. It means it would work both for Sever as well as for the proc from Bloodless Scream. So that is going to probably be the strongest damage multiplier. But we have to remember that having that increased attack speed is double dipping. It makes us attack faster, and it also increases the raw damage of the effect. So to be able to calculate how valuable that is to us, we have to figure out how fast we would be attacking and how much faster we will be. To do that, I go over to my attack speed breakpoints, because I'm going to be using a 0.9 attack speed weapon. I can't choose a different weapon. Sorry for the flashbang. But at 100% attack speed, where there isn't actually a breakpoint for this, but I would be at 23 frames for my attack. If I had a perfect accelerating aspect on a ring, that would bump me up to 130 total attack speed, which would bring me up to 20 frames per attack. So to be able to determine the difference between 23 frames and 20 frames, you literally just divide the big number by the small number. And the effective damage multiplier of gaining that much attack speed, which, since it directly translates to increased number of attacks, which is a direct multiplier of the chance to be able to trigger it on average per attack, or rather per second, we can equate this to a 15% damage multiplier, or a 1.15. Add on to that, we have to consider the difference between having a 2 times damage multiplier from attack versus a 2.3. Funnily enough, it comes out to be the same number, right? Because 2.3 versus 2 is actually the exact same thing as 23 divided by 20. So this is also a 1.15 damage multiplier. Put those two things together, and it means the accelerating aspect for this build is roughly a 1.3225 times damage multiplier. Now, on paper, on average, over the expected, average distribution of procs and damage scaling that is available for the build, this is just strictly worse than Damned, because what this says is that less than a 55% damage multiplier, which would be a 1.55. Now, this is a little bit nebulous though, right? Because technically speaking, being able to cast all of my skills faster is a lot more than just a 32% damage multiplier, because we also have to assume or consider all of the things that we cast which are not Sever. Because I'm going to have other skills on my skill bar, other things that I'm going to need to be able to cast for this build to work. And all of these things benefit from being able to cast them more quickly. So the most extreme example of this, which, a lot of people don't necessarily think about anymore, is something like Blood Mist. Blood Mist has an animation, and Blood Mist animation takes an amount of frames to become immune. You know all those times back in the day where you would click Blood Mist, but you would still die, and you go, what the F, I clicked Blood Mist? There is a number of frames into the animation when you actually become immune in the Blood Mist. It doesn't just start the moment that you trigger it. So how valuable is it to shave off 1 or 2 frames from that? Nearly impossible to calculate. Nowadays, luckily, we don't really have to use Blood Mist. We're actually going to end up using things, like Enhanced Bone Prison to be able to further increase our damage. But even this, the rate at which Bone Prison drops onto the field and I'm able to go back to casting Sever, how valuable is that when I have to weave in these other casts? Or things like Corpse Explosion, which I'm going to need to be able to cast to gain Flesh Eater. Really, really hard to articulate, or really, really hard to quantify. So if I were to very roughly try to modify the expected value from this aspect, I would bump it up by like 1 or 2%. So I would roughly equate this to a 35% damage multiplier for the build's overall efficiency. Like quite literally, how long would it take me to do a pit if I put this on? Even then, it still is overperformed by damned, where I don't think that the utility gained necessarily modifies the overall performance of the build to the point where I would have greater success. But then we have to ask questions like, what other options do we have for even increasing the attack speed here? Basic attack speed actually doesn't help us because that doesn't, while that goes into Cap 2, that goes into Cap 2 very specifically for basic skills, which is not the same thing as us gaining attack speed in Cap 2. You need to gain the attack speed as a stat for it to increase the damage from Bloodless Scream, not just be at Cap 2 for the skill that you're using. You can, why am I looking at the Barbarian here? So Rathmas Chosen is actually a really, really good example. Rathmas Chosen says that if I have a blood skill which would overpower, I will gain 55% increased attack speed. Rathmas Chosen is a really strong candidate for something that you would want to include on the build. Because if we look at the difference between 100% attack speed and 155% attack speed, now we're talking about a difference of 5 frames. So if I were to redo this calculation, it would be 23 divided by 18. That alone, in the amount of attack speed that we're going to gain, is a 27% damage multiplier. Now remember, if I had both of these things, the value of them actually goes down, because the difference of gaining like 1 frame versus the 5 frames effectively has diminishing returns. It's still incredibly powerful, and you should always stack attack speed as much as you possibly can. But then we have to start looking at the difference in what our damage multiplier would be. Well, if I normally have 100% attack speed, which is a 2x multi, this would bring me up to a 2.55 divided by 2, and we get 27.5. So if I were to take this and this, this is equal to this number versus this number. All of a sudden, Rathmas is equal to a 62.9% damage multiplier. That massively overperforms in comparison to you putting Damned onto the build, because we get all of the utility of the increased attack speed and the value of it as a damage multiplier is higher. That comes back to our character in that idea of the puzzle in front of me. Attack speed's in the red. Why is attack speed in the red? Because how would I add a blood skill to this build that would overpower and not reduce the ability to continue to output damage via Sever? Because any blood skill that I cast would need to overpower 100% of the time for it to be relevant to the conversation. And there's not a lot of ways to do that. So we have a couple different systems that we could look at. Instead of using Shadow Blight, which technically speaking we don't really need, I just wanted to be a full proc build, but probably Affliction with its damage multiplication would actually be a better scaler on the build. But obviously we can use something like Rathma's Vigor. Rathma's Vigor says that over 15 seconds, eventually a blood skill will overpower. And if I were to pick up Blood Orbs, this will happen more often. When you consider Rathma's Vigor, no, this isn't going to increase the damage of our Bloodless Scream. It's definitely not going to work on Sever. But you start to ask questions like, well, why Sever in the first place? Why not Blood Lance? Blood Lance has a pretty high lucky hit chance for the skill, very low essence cost, and you can actually go Paranormal Blood Lance. Paranormal Blood Lance says that as long as there are 2 targets, you'll actually gain even more attack speed. Go to our attack speed calculator here, or if I were to consider it, theoretically speaking, we are very close to gaining an additional frame. We're actually 0.7 attack speed off unless we had a perfect Rathmas. So we would actually have just enough attack speed to be able to gain an additional frame here. And as the frames get smaller, the value that you get from them is larger. That sounds like it's against what I was saying before. I meant here using accelerating and Rathmas Chosen has diminishing returns, but increasing your frame count, even at low frame count, actually gets stronger and stronger, just to clarify that. But okay, so we could technically get up to a higher frame here by utilizing this, but what do we lose? Well, We would lose out on Sever really being relevant for the build because I would just be using Bloodlance as my primary procer. Bloodlance in a pack has a similar proc ability for the lucky hit chance, since every time that you do damage with the Bloodlance, all lance targets take damage, and each one of those instances can trigger the lucky hit chance, and it's per Bloodlance which hits them. The other benefit here is that we're going to be generating Blood Orbs. A cool part about generating Blood Orbs is that Blood Orbs would allow us to better benefit from Blood Begets Blood, a Paragon board that we are forced to take because there are no other damage multipliers for a Shadow crit focused build or a Darkness crit focused build. But being able to pick up the Blood Orbs here would help. Not only that, picking up the Blood Orbs would make it so that we actually overpower more quickly with Rathmas. Although that being said, since Bloodlance would be overpowering once every 6 casts, and we'd be casting fast enough where we would actually have permanent uptime on Rathmas from this, we wouldn't even need Blood Begets, or we wouldn't even need Rathmas. So we can actually go back down to Affliction. So the question becomes, is that more valuable than the Sever? Well, the Sever aspect is technically taking up space here. So I would be able to put on our Rathmas Chosen, and the Sever is currently taking up space. It is effectively a double damage, since it would double the effectiveness of Sever's ability to trigger the effect in the first place. But I would regain an aspect slot, so I could put Damned here. So I would regain 50% damage. Is the 55% increased damage as valuable as doubling the total instances of it triggering? That is almost relevant, right? So over here, we are like solving this puzzle of the attack speed. It's going from red up to orange and maybe even up to yellow. And then all of a sudden, another section of the build is going red, which is damage scalability. Because the moment that we think about using blood, the moment that we consider using a blood skill for being able to trigger Rathmas, which is a higher multiplier on the aspects, all of a sudden we're losing out on so much of the value from Bloodless Scream, because it won't be a darkness skill. It won't gain the damage multiplication. It won't care about the skill ranks to darkness. It won't really do damage. Your Bloodlance wouldn't really do damage on the build. So the aspects, even though they're telling a story of better scalability of damage, you're losing out on all of this. And Sever will be a major component of the build's damage output, basically because that's the only thing that really makes sense. There is an upside, though, because in utilizing a blood skill, in not using Sever, all of a sudden, we can drop our boots. Dropping the boots would mean that we could use boots that have intelligence, maximum life, and armor on it. So now we don't have to use that incense for being able to gain armor, but we would be able to gain more maximum life. And maybe this build is actually just too squishy to be able to survive. And at 6,000 life, that actually might be the case, because it turns out that the majority of items that you would want to use don't have maximum life on it. Bloodless Scream doesn't have maximum life on it. Air of Perdition doesn't have maximum life on it. Fist of Fate doesn't have maximum life on it. Blood Moon Breaches doesn't. Your boots don't. And you can't fit it on any of your gear pieces. So what if the build just can't function because we have survivability over here as this big red flag? What if you literally can't survive? It doesn't matter if you could do the most damage, you would literally die. Well, what do you do about that? So this is a very quick little insane look into how I consider builds, how I see builds, and how my brain conceptualizes all the various things that kind of need to happen. And you can think about it as like a giant check sheet. So I'm going to, turn this into a timestamp and then go through the idea of the check sheet, the to-do list, the task list of what you need to consider while theory crafting. So you can hopefully translate that insane ramble into proactive steps. Your build needs to be able to do certain things. It needs to be able to do damage. It needs to be able to survive. And as kind of like a sub feature, it needs to fulfill its primary role, which tends to be fun or successfully building into a fantasy. So when we think about the build, survivability, obviously that's armor cap, that's resistance cap, that is enough maximum life and or barrier generation, as well as damage reduction. So when you're thinking about your build, you should look at options that are available for that and understand that basically with somewhere around like 20 to 30% damage reduction across the board, you can expect to be able to survive most content in this game with about 10,000 maximum life and a similar amount of barrier. So if you can generate that much barrier and you can have that much life and you're willing to actually avoid some of the big shots like in Dariel's various one-shots or Belial's big crab claw hit, you can probably survive most circumstances, at least on the Necromancer. I can't really speak to the other classes. Then we have to talk about scaling our damage. We have to pick a damage type and see all of the things which would increase that damage type. typically speaking, in Diablo 4, you can only scale one thing's damage. If you are an Earthquake Barbarian, making tornadoes do more damage wouldn't really make sense. Or if you're an Earthquake Barbarian, making it so that your Iron Maelstrom does more damage wouldn't typically make sense. On the Necromancer, if I'm trying to do damage with Sever, I probably shouldn't try to also scale Bloodlance's damage. You typically can't do it. It's mostly because of the fact that this stat right here, the skill deals double damage, because that only works for one thing and you can't add multiple of these to a build, you really can't scale them. And you would always want to make one damage source more efficient than trying to differentiate into multiple damage sources. Then you have to start asking the question of not only which adds on the largest multiplier, but in comparison to other multipliers, right? When people tend to screw up sometimes when I see them do this, they'll go, okay, Damned is a 55% damage multiplier. If it was instead Grasping Veins is a 50% damage multiplier. Obviously, Damned is bigger, but whenever you're trying to take something out and add something in, the question isn't, this is going to seem silly. A lot of people will go, well, I get to add Grasping Veins to my build. That increases my damage by 50%, but they're not comparing it to what the alternative would be. You always have to compare the difference in multipliers, because Damned, in comparison to Grasping Veins, isn't a 55% damage multiplier. It is the difference of a 1.55 versus a 1.5. So Damned is only adding on 3.33% damage to your build in comparison to Grasping Veins. So basically, that part of the theory crafting just comes down to whenever you are comparing your build versus a different version of the build, you have to compare the difference in the multipliers, not just think about what the big number is and think that your build has gained that much damage. And then we talk about the fantasy, right? A really, really good example of this, right? We will build Blight all the time. Blight will tend to use Ebon Piercer to do dot damage, but everybody will tend to think about the idea of X-Falls. X-Falls Ring, right? X-Falls Ring says that it works with dots, so your damage over time has a lucky hit chance to be able to do an instance of damage. The fantasy here might be a bunch of additional procs on top of your build, but these things don't really work well together. One, dots are just very bad at triggering lucky hit chance, per the first thing that I said at the beginning of this weird rambly video. But scaling a dots damage does not scale X-Falls damage. X-Falls can crit, dots cannot crit. So attempting to scale a dots damage and X-Falls damage doesn't make sense because the same stats don't work for both of them. So you're getting less than the stated value of that stat in comparison to a build where everything all scales up in parallel. They all scale the same. So when we think about the fantasy of something, we do also have to ask the question of, is that fantasy a reality? Does it work? I want my dots to trigger things. Can they? Not really. So sadly, you really just shouldn't explore stuff like that. But if you can deal with survivability, meaning make sure to cap everything, get appropriate damage reductions, make sure that you have barrier generation, and that the maximum life that you have is actually enough to be able to survive the content that you're doing on average. You have the idea of what your damage does, how it scales, and how everything builds into the damage that you do. And then the primary, focus of the build, what it's attempting to accomplish as a fantasy and what its structure is, literally what the identity of the build is. If you have those three things in front of you as a checklist, and then you just mark off successfully doing these things, you don't necessarily have to build the most optimized thing. You don't have to build the perfect nitpick 5 intelligence versus 3 additive damage comparison. But if you follow that generalized idea and try to think about it in these parts where they have interconnectivity, I think you'll have a pretty good time theory crafting. And that's how I think about my builds. If that gives you any insight, let me know down in the comments. If I just sounded like a lunatic, also let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Brand new to the channel, and this is your first impression of me? Wowie caboodles. You basically ran into me when we are doing a little bit of this. Hold on. If this is your first impression of me, I promise I don't show off how crazy I am as often as I did in this video. You'll typically get a much more refined and not lunatic level of energy. But if you like the lunatic level of energy, let me know too. But subscribe to the channel. I promise you I'll be bringing you good information as well, not just this wild theory crafting random TED Talk podcast I did. Thanks for watching. I hope that helps in any meaningful way. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.